In 1971, doctors stared at photographs so disturbing they wanted to burn them. Not for privacy. For sanity. What they saw in that Virginia hospital room broke every law of nature. And the government classified it at the highest level, reserved only for national threats. But to understand what happened that October morning, we need to go back 200 years. Back to a man who thought he could play God. This story starts with Joshua Whittaker in 1847. He wasn't looking for farmland when he claimed 200 acres in Virginia's Roanoke County. He was looking for a place to disappear. The land was worthless. Thin soil, brutal winters, and 3 days from the nearest town through terrain that could kill you. Other settlers avoided it completely. But Joshua? He brought 2 wives. Martha was his legal wife. Rebecca was her younger sister. He called her a companion, a frontier term that let the local preacher marry him to both women in one ceremony. By 1855, they had 14 children. All from one man and 2 sisters. Here's where this stops being a story about frontier hardship and becomes something else entirely. Those 14 children never looked beyond their mountain. They never sought partners from other families. Instead, they turned to each other. Joshua had convinced them of something twisted. He wrote in journals we found hidden under rotted floorboards, "The blood of man has been thinned by mixing with other nations. But in our veins runs pure fire. To mix it is to destroy it. To keep it pure is the only true worship." He didn't just teach this madness, he made his children breathe it like air. The Whittakers weren't just a family. In Joshua's mind, they were chosen people. Guardians of some sacred bloodline. The outside world was corruption. Their mountain was salvation. So the first generation married each other. Brother to sister. Cousin to cousin. By the 1880s, the family tree wasn't a tree anymore. It was a knot. A circle. A snake eating its own tail. They were building something new, generation by generation. And they were willing to sacrifice everything to finish it. The children born from these marriages were different. Neighbors spoke in whispers about the Whittaker children. They described kids who never cried but made soft, bird-like sounds. Children who walked with lurching steps, like the ground was uneven under their feet. But it was their eyes people remembered most. Pale, washed-out blue. Empty. They didn't look at you, they looked through you, like you were the ghost in their world. With each generation, the circle grew tighter. The isolation more complete. What had started as Joshua's twisted philosophy became an unstoppable machine. The mountain held its secrets. The family kept growing inward, folding back on itself again and again. Creating something that nature never intended. For over 100 years, this continued in the shadows. Each generation more isolated than the last. Each birth taking them further from what we call human. Until that day in 1971. When that 17-year-old girl went into labor that October morning, no one could have predicted what would happen next. The doctors, the nurses, the specialists who were called in, none of them were prepared for what they saw. The child that was born didn't just break medical records. It broke reality itself. What exactly did they find in that delivery room? What was so horrifying that the government buried it at the highest classification level? The answer will change everything you think you know about what's possible in this world. As the 1800s ended, something changed. Local doctors stopped coming to the mountain. Dr. Alastair Finch, a physician who had seen it all, wrote to his brother, "I have delivered babies without limbs and babies with 2 heads. I've seen nature's cruelest tricks. But I will never go to that house again. What's being born up there is not of God." But here's the terrifying part, the Whittakers didn't see a curse. They saw success. Every child born with deformities was celebrated. Club feet. The blood is getting stronger. Silent, vacant stares. The vessel is changing to hold it. They believed they were purifying their bloodline, burning away what they called genetic weakness from the outside world, moving towards some perfect ideal that only they were brave enough to imagine. By 1900, they had created something that shouldn't exist, a biological paradox. The simple marriages between siblings and cousins weren't enough anymore. The family elders wanted to concentrate on the bloodline faster. So they developed what they called the rotation system. It was a human breeding program more complex than anything used for livestock. They kept charts and diagrams. Every fertile woman was assigned a sequence of male partners. She would have a child with her brother 1 year, her uncle the next, her own father the year after that. The goal was horrifying in its precision: create children with the most tangled genetics possible. Layer relationship upon relationship until the concepts of parent, child, and sibling disappeared completely. They stopped recording names. Instead, they tracked genetic contributions. Human beings became numbers in a generations-long equation. In 1925, this system created what they considered their masterpiece, Charity Whittaker. Her birth should have been impossible. According to the family's own twisted records, she was conceived during a single fertile cycle involving 3 different men. Her grandfather, her grandfather's brother, and her own uncle. Think about that for a moment. Genetically, Charity was simultaneously her mother's daughter, her own first cousin, her own niece, and her own aunt. When doctors finally got a blood sample decades later, they threw out the results. They assumed it was contaminated. They ran it again and again. The results never changed. Charity's DNA contained patterns that broke the basic rules of genetics. She should have died in the womb. Instead, she survived. And in that mountain compound, she thrived. Imagine being raised in a world where every truth was backwards. Charity learned that the outside world was full of mongrels and deluded souls. She was taught that her twisted genetics made her special, noble, close to the perfect circle her family was creating. By age 15, she was chosen to continue the work. She became pregnant with her first child. The father was her own father, who was also her uncle and cousin. That child's name was Thomas. He would grow up to become Sarah May's father. For the Whittaker children, normal family terms meant nothing. A man could be your father, brother, and uncle all at once. A woman could be your mother and your cousin. These basic relationships that anchor the rest of us, they had been deliberately erased. The family tree wasn't a tree anymore. It was a single, thick column of blood. Children grew up without knowing who they really were in relation to anyone else. There were no clear boundaries. No simple connections. Just one all-consuming identity, the bloodline. By the 1920s, the Whittaker experiment was working exactly as planned. They had created a self-contained biological system that fed on itself. Each generation was less human and more, something else. Something the mountain was creating in its dark shadows. But this was just the beginning. The rotation system would continue for decades more, creating increasingly impossible genetic combinations. And in 1971, all of this twisted breeding would finally produce something so shocking that it would terrify doctors and force the government to bury the truth forever. By the 1960s, the Whittakers had stopped thinking of themselves as just a family. To them, their bloodline had become something alive. Something with its own will. They had a phrase, "The blood calls to blood." They used it to justify every forbidden union, every twisted marriage between relatives. They believed each new child born from their ever-tightening circle brought them closer to what Joshua had called the divine form. A state of genetic purity so perfect it would unlock hidden human abilities. Powers of the mind. Resistance to disease. A connection to the earth that the deluded mongrels of the outside world had lost. After more than a century, the experiment was reaching its peak. The Whittakers had become their own isolated world. They spoke their own dialect, a strange, lilting version of Mountain English mixed with words they had invented. They practiced their own religion, worship of their genetic code. And they guarded their terrible secret with absolute fury. In 1971, that secret was about to become flesh. Sarah Mae Whitaker was 17 when she realized this pregnancy was different. It wasn't her first. By the family's brutal system, she had been considered a woman since age 12. She had already given birth twice, at 14 and 16. Both children were born silent. Tiny, misshapen things that gasped for a few moments before going still. The family elders didn't mourn these deaths. They called them offerings to the blood, necessary failures on the path to success. They buried the infants in unmarked graves, whispering prayers and giving thanks for the purity of the attempt. But this time was different. Sarah Mae could feel it. The life inside her didn't move like a normal baby. No gentle kicks or soft rolls. Sarah Mae described it to her mother as trapped lightning. It wasn't a flutter, it was a pulse. A low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through her bones and made her teeth ache. It felt less like a child and more like a machine waking up inside her. Her belly grew at an alarming rate, stretching her skin until it was thin and translucent. You could see the dark veins writhing underneath. The family wasn't concerned. They were ecstatic. The elders gathered around Sarah Mae, placing their hands on her swollen stomach, their eyes wide with terrifying hope. "This is the one," they whispered. "The culmination. The perfect circle is closing." They began preparing rituals that hadn't been performed in generations. They were getting ready to welcome their Messiah. But while they celebrated, Sarah Mae was dying. This pregnancy wasn't just growing inside her, it was eating her alive. She was a vessel being drained to feed the impossible life she carried. In the final 3 months, she lost over 40 pounds. Even as her belly swelled to a grotesque size, her face became skeletal. Her skin turned gray and waxy. Her thick brown hair fell out in clumps, leaving bald patches on her scalp. Her teeth loosened and fell out while she tried to eat the thin broth her mother fed her. But the most disturbing change was in her eyes. They had been deep, soulful brown. Now they were shifting color day by day, turning a pale, sickly yellow. At night, in the dim light of oil lamps, her family swore they glowed. The elders saw these horrifying symptoms as signs of divine transformation. They believed the child was rewriting her very being, preparing her to birth a new kind of human. Medical experts who later reviewed her condition recognized it immediately: acute genetic toxicity. The fetus was so genetically twisted that her body was treating it as poison. Her immune system had collapsed. Her organs were failing. She was being devoured by her own child. On October 13, 1971, Sarah Mae went into labor. She hadn't been conscious for 3 days. This forced the family to break their most sacred rule: they needed outside help. They wanted medical documentation of the miracle they were about to receive. They carried her down the mountain, never realizing they were bringing their darkest secret into the light. Dr. Margaret Powell had seen everything in her 20-year career. Conjoined twins, babies with organs on the outside of their bodies, children born without limbs. She was a veteran of nature's cruelest tricks. But when the Whitaker family carried Sarah Mae's unconscious body through the emergency room doors, every instinct screamed that this was different. The family themselves were shocking. Tall, gaunt figures with pale, vacant eyes, moving with silent, synchronized purpose. They didn't ask for help, they demanded an audience. Thomas, the father who looked both 50 and 25 at the same time, spoke in a low, gravelly voice: "She is delivering the culmination. We require a record." The birth took 14 hours of hell. Sarah Mae never woke up. Her body had become a battlefield for a war it had already lost. For Dr. Powell and her nurses, the delivery room began to feel like a space outside normal reality. The air grew thick and heavy. The fetal monitor created a constant whispering static that put everyone on edge. The Whitaker family stood outside the door, not speaking, just waiting. Their collective stare felt like pressure on the other side of the wall. 3 times during labor, nurses had to leave the room, overcome with unexplained nausea and dread. One nurse simply walked out of the hospital and never returned. Equipment behaved strangely. Lights flickered. A steel tray of surgical tools vibrated off its stand and crashed to the floor. Through it all, that rhythmic whispering pulse from Sarah May's womb continued, like something counting down. In the final moments, just before the child emerged, profound silence fell over the room. The monitor flatlined. The whispering stopped. For one terrifying second, Dr. Powell thought both mother and child were gone. Then it came. And the world would never be the same for those few people in that room. What Dr. Powell saw in her hands broke every law of biology she had ever learned. It was alive, breathing in shallow, rattling gasps. Its heart beat in a frantic, irregular rhythm. Its eyes moved. But everything was wrong. The head was enormous, nearly twice the size of a normal newborn's. The skull was so thin you could see through it. But instead of a brain, there was a cluster of dozens of smaller gray lobes, each pulsing with its own sick rhythm. The arms emerged from the chest, not the shoulders. They ended in hands with no thumbs, just spirals of 7 or 8 long, delicate fingers. The legs were wound around each other like thick vines. They ended not in feet, but in 2 small, perfectly formed faces. Tiny faces with eyes that blinked and mouths that moved in silent, constant motion. But the main head held the true horror, 3 faces layered and overlapping like double-exposed photographs. One central face with 2 others partially merged beside it. They shared eyes and nostrils. All 3 mouths were stretched open in permanent, silent screams. 3 doctors walked out of that delivery room. One young resident vomited in the hallway, resigned the next day, and never practiced medicine again. He simply disappeared. Dr. Powell faced an impossible question: was this thing human? Did it deserve medical protection? Or was keeping it alive an act of cruelty? She made a decision that would haunt her forever: she would keep it alive. Not out of compassion, but from cold, terrifying curiosity. What were the limits of life? How could something so broken continue to breathe? For 6 days, Mercy General Hospital became unwilling keeper of a nightmare. The child, officially labeled Infant Doe Whitaker, never cried. Instead, it hummed constantly, a sound that made nurses' skin crawl like static electricity. Its multiple eyes moved independently, tracking different people with focused, impossible intelligence. Despite the malformed brain, it was aware. It was watching. The Whitaker family maintained a constant vigil in the hallway. They didn't sleep or eat, just stood and waited under fluorescent lights, casting long shadows. When nurses passed, they asked in their strange dialect, "Is the culmination well?" They showed no horror at the child's appearance. Instead, they showed profound reverence. They sang to it through the glass, haunting melodies that somehow calmed its movements. The child's humming would sync with their songs, creating bizarre harmony that made everyone's hair stand on end. The Whitaker family called it the perfect one. Through the hospital glass, they worshipped it with a faith that was as pure as it was insane. They brought offerings, polished pieces of wood, stones arranged in spiral patterns, faded photographs of their ancestors. In those old photos, you could see the story. Generation by generation, faces changing. Eyes getting wider. Jaws becoming more pronounced. A creeping alteration of human form, all leading to this thing in the incubator. The child was dying, but not in any way medicine could explain. Normal infants with such severe deformities would suffer organ failure, heart, lungs, kidneys shutting down. But this child wasn't failing. It was dissolving. Dr. Powell documented everything in a private logbook that was later confiscated. She wrote, "The tissue isn't dying, it's breaking down at a molecular level. Dark patches appear on the skin, but they're not bruises. They're windows. I can see internal structures turning to dark, thick fluid. But here's the strangest part, as its body broke down, the child grew calmer. The frantic movements of its many eyes slowed. For the first time, they all focused together. The three faces, locked in silent screams for 5 days, began to relax. Their mouths closed. The expressions softened into something that looked like peace. It was as if existing in our physical world was agony, and dissolving was relief. On the morning of the 6th day, night nurse Patricia Williams went for her routine check. She stopped dead in the doorway, hand flying to her mouth. The humming had stopped. The incubator was silent. But the child was still alive, chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. During the night, it had somehow rearranged itself. Its fused limbs, twisted torso, and massive head had coiled into a perfect geometric spiral, a pattern that should have been impossible given its anatomy. With what looked like serene smiles on all three faces, it drew one final breath and was gone. Within hours, they came. Not local police or state officials, federal agents in black, unmarked cars that glided silently into the parking lot. Men in dark, perfectly tailored suits who moved with terrifying efficiency. They didn't show FBI or CIA badges. Their credentials were from something called the Office of Genetic Security, an agency no one had ever heard of. They claimed to be from the CDC investigating genetic contagion. But Dr. Powell knew better. These weren't doctors or scientists. They were custodians of secrets. They confiscated everything. The child's body was sealed in a lead-lined container and taken away. All medical records, charts, lab results, seized. Dr. Powell's private logbook, gone. The family's offerings, the strange monitor recordings, all disappeared into evidence bags. Every staff member who had witnessed anything was debriefed for hours, then forced to sign thick stacks of non-disclosure agreements bound by the National Security Act. Speaking about what they'd seen was now legally treason. The official death certificate was a masterpiece of lies, cause of death, multiple congenital anomalies. The child was erased. It had never existed. Sarah May died 3 days later. Her body, ravaged and poisoned by the pregnancy, simply gave out. Her death certificate listed complications from childbirth, another clean lie covering impossible truth. The Whitaker family took her body back up the mountain. They were given the falsified death certificate for their perfect one and vanished into their isolated kingdom. In following years, authorities tried to contact them. They would drive up the winding dirt road only to find empty cabins with dark windows. No sign of life. But hunters told strange stories. Faint, high-pitched singing in forests on moonless nights. Tall, thin figures moving through trees at dusk, always at the edge of vision. The Whitakers had become ghosts. Their true story was locked in a government vault hundreds of miles away, a story never meant to be told. But secrets always find a way out, even after 50 years. In 2021, the files were quietly declassified. Not with press conferences or announcements, but through a digital upload to a forgotten government archive server. Buried among thousands of other documents, designed to be overlooked. Almost no one noticed. But someone did. A small group of independent researchers, geneticists and historians who had heard whispers of the Whitaker baby for decades, finally found the declassified files. What they discovered was far more disturbing than any rumor. The child's DNA was like a Rosetta Stone of forbidden science. Analysis with modern technology confirmed its genetic code was unlike anything ever seen. It contained sequences that appeared non-human, but also sequences so perfectly structured they looked artificial. The generations of inbreeding hadn't been random chaos. It was as if someone had been guiding it. The report revealed something shocking: the family's rotation system wasn't their own invention. It was a formula, a complex genetic algorithm they had followed for over a century. A set of instructions passed down from a source they could no longer remember. The child wasn't an accident of incest. It was the result of an experiment. An experiment in creating a bridge between what we are and something else. The final page contained a single memorandum from the Office of Genetic Security. The investigator wrote, "The Whitaker breeding program was not random. It followed a clear pattern. The level of organization suggests external influence or a pre-existing doctrine of unknown origin." But here's the most chilling part: the Whitaker clan cannot be presumed to be the only instance of such a program. We recommend investigating other isolated communities in Appalachia, the Ozarks, and the Pacific Northwest to determine if similar experiments are currently underway. That recommendation was officially denied. The case was closed. They never investigated further. They found something in those Virginia mountains that terrified them, and they decided the safest thing was to look away. So what were they building? The family believed they were creating a messiah, a being of pure blood with abilities beyond understanding. But the government report hints at something darker. It suggests the Whitakers weren't the scientists. They were the lab rats. Their fanatical beliefs were a form of control, a story fed to them to ensure cooperation in an experiment they didn't know they were part of. But who was the real experimenter? Joshua Whitaker's journals mention a visitor who came to him in the mountains, a man with eyes like polished stones who gave him the sacred laws of blood. Was this delusion, or the beginning of something that stretched back into history's shadows? The symbols the family used, the spiral patterns on their stones and in the child's final impossible posture, aren't random. They're ancient, predating most known civilizations. They're linked to fringe theories about pre-human intelligence, about beings who may have seeded life on this planet and left behind a hidden instruction manual for evolution. A manual someone found. A manual someone is still using. The story of Sarah Mae Whitaker isn't just about the horrors of incest. It's about the terrifying possibility that human history and genetics might not be our own. That we exist within a program, a grand, patient experiment. And sometimes, in dark corners of the world, the results are born. The Whitaker compound is gone now. The state claimed the land for a national park in the late 1990s. The cabins were bulldozed, the woods allowed to reclaim the scarred earth. There's no marker, no sign of the century of secrets that unfolded there. To any hiker, it's just peaceful Appalachian wilderness. But park rangers tell stories. They describe a strange silence over the old Whitaker land, a place where birds don't sing and insects don't buzz. Equipment malfunctions. Compasses spin wildly. GPS devices lose signal. And some rangers, speaking off the record late at night, admit to seeing things. A tall figure watching from the tree line. Pale yellow eyes glowing in darkness. They dismiss it as tricks of light or folklore. They have to, because the alternative is too monstrous to contemplate, that something is still out there. That the experiment wasn't a failure, but just one more step. That the bloodline didn't die, but simply moved on. The silence in those woods isn't peaceful. It's anticipation. Something holding its breath, waiting to be born again. The government agents didn't bury the truth to hide a crime. They buried it to protect us from knowledge we're not equipped to handle. The knowledge that the human form isn't a final draft, it's just a template. And templates can be rewritten. A whispered rumor has persisted for centuries in isolated parts of Appalachia. Locals tell stories about the Hollow Children or the Tmiz Children. They say that not all families who went deep into the mountains in the 1700s and 1800s were simple settlers. Some were following a different call. They were members of ancient European sects who fled the old world to continue forbidden practices in secret. These practices revolved around bloodlines. They believed specific genetic pairings could, over many generations, produce something not entirely human. A vessel that could communicate with old gods or the earth itself. These families would seek the most isolated valleys and begin their great work. They would cut themselves off from the world and turn inward, their family trees becoming tangled knots, just like the Whitakers. Most experiments ended in madness and extinction, bloodlines collapsing under genetic decay. But every few generations, a family would succeed. They would produce a hollow child, one that didn't cry, had strange eyes, and could supposedly command forest animals and speak to the wind. The Whitaker story isn't an anomaly. It's simply the only time the outside world got a glimpse. The story shifts now to a chilling possibility in the present. Think about private genetic companies today. Billionaire tech moguls obsessed with life extension and hacking the human code. They pour billions into research that happens far from public oversight, on private islands, in underground laboratories. They believe human evolution is too slow, too random. That it can be improved, directed, perfected. They're doing exactly what Joshua Whitaker set out to do, but with different tools. Instead of religious fervor and isolation, they use gene editing technology, artificial wombs, and AI to model genetic outcomes. They're writing a new gospel, not in leather journals, but in lines of code. What if the Whitaker experiment wasn't the end, but the beginning? A crude prototype for a new, digital, far more efficient program? What if the knowledge the government buried in 1971 wasn't lost, but found? Snatched up by powerful figures who saw not horror, but a blueprint. Proof of concept. The true terror isn't that a mountain family created a monster. The true terror is that they proved it was possible. And now the people trying to do it again have infinitely more power, resources, and reasons to hide their work. The declassified file contains one grainy black and white photograph that was missed during confiscation. Nurse Patricia Williams took it with a personal camera on the fourth day. The image is blurry, distorted by the incubator's curved glass. But you can see it, the impossible form, the oversized translucent head, the twisted limbs. And you can see the eyes. Even in the poor quality photo, the eyes are clear. Dozens of them across 3 faces, all staring directly at the camera. Staring directly at you. There's intelligence in that gaze. Not the vacant look of a deformed infant, but an ancient, weary, profoundly intelligent stare of something that knows. Something that has seen things we cannot imagine. This wasn't a child. It was a visitor. A biological probe sent from somewhere unknown through a gateway built of human flesh and blood. Its brief, tragic life wasn't a failure. It was a message. And those silent screaming faces were trying to tell us something. Here's the final gut punch. When authorities demanded to know who the father was, every adult male in the Whitaker family claimed responsibility. Not out of shame, but pride. The official story says they were all involved in systematic incest. But what if it was something else? What if they genuinely didn't know? In the family's journals, they believed a culmination child couldn't have a single father. They thought such a child was the product of the entire bloodline's focused ancestral will. Fathered by the family itself, a collective impregnation. Medically, that's impossible. The talk of a delusional cult. But the child in that incubator was also impossible. Its DNA was impossible. Its 6 days survival was impossible. At what point do we stop applying our rules to something that clearly operates outside them? The authorities closed the case because they found a tidy box for it, a tragic story of abuse in an isolated community. Horrible, but understandable. Humans. But the real truth they saw and buried is that what happened in that delivery room wasn't human at all. What we were never meant to know is that the Whitaker family was not unique. The declassified file contained a heavily redacted appendix listing other family names and remote locations. A farm in the Ozarks in the 1930s where an entire family of 12 simply vanished overnight. A small island community off the coast of Maine where no children were born for 50 years, then suddenly 7 women gave birth on the same day to infants who all died within hours, displaying similar genetic anomalies. A commune in the New Mexico desert that worshipped a geometric deity and practiced ritualistic breeding before the entire compound was mysteriously destroyed by wildfire in the 1980s. No survivors. The Whitaker case wasn't isolated. It was just the one that got out. The one where the experiment was pushed too far, too fast, and broke containment. We are living on a planet seeded with these secret, patient experiments. Little pockets of humanity being cultivated like rare orchids for a purpose we can only guess at. They are control groups in an experiment so vast, so ancient, that we cannot even see the walls of the laboratory. Can you imagine that? To be born into a life that is not your own. To be a single link in a chain, your only purpose is to forge the next one stronger and stranger than yourself. Your body, your love, your children, not yours, but tools for a project that began centuries before you were born and will continue long after you're gone. This was Sarah Mae Whitaker's reality. Was she a victim or willing participant? Did she feel horror at what she carried, or religious ecstasy? The records are silent on her inner life. She's a ghost in her own story, a vessel whose humanity was erased by the monstrosity of her purpose. For a moment, let's try to see her. A 17-year-old girl, her body wasting away, feeling that alien pulse inside her, surrounded by her family's fervent, hopeful faces. Did she ever, in the dead of night, wish she could run away? Escape down the mountain and see the world she was taught was corrupt and evil? Did she ever dream of a normal life, a normal child? Or was her mind so completely colonized by the family's ideology that she truly believed she was handmaiden to a god? We'll never know. Her voice was silenced, first by her family, then by the thing in her womb, finally by the government that buried her story. She's the ultimate victim, a human sacrifice on the altar of terrible, hidden science. By learning this story, you are breaking the seal. The silence carefully constructed for 50 years is now broken. The knowledge is out, and it changes things. The world feels a little thinner now, doesn't it? The shadows in old, forgotten places feel deeper. The idea that we are alone, that we are masters of our genetic destiny, seems more fragile. Sarah Mae Whitaker's story is a virus of thought. Once exposed, you can't unknow it. You start seeing patterns. You look at society's fringes, strange cults, isolated communities, billionaire bunkers, and wonder who else is tending a secret garden. Who else is following a sacred blueprint? You are a witness now, just like Dr. Powell and Nurse Williams. You've seen what was born in that room. That makes you a guardian of this secret, a secret some would still kill to protect. The child didn't just die. The seized medical records contained one last entry from Dr. Powell, written in shaky handwriting moments after the child's death, before agents arrived. A single sentence, underlined 3 times. Body temperature is rising post-mortem. This is biologically impossible. When life ceases, bodies cool, it's an immutable law of thermodynamics. But the Whitaker child was different. For nearly an hour after its heart stopped, its body temperature climbed from 98.6 to 105 to 110 degrees, until the monitoring equipment shorted out. A nurse who touched the incubator glass suffered second-degree burns. What was happening inside that twisted body? Not decomposition, some other process. A final energetic transformation. As if death wasn't an end, but a trigger. A release of concentrated, twisted potential built up over 5 generations. It arrived as a biological entity, but may have left as something else entirely. A burst of data. A psychic signal. A seed planted back into the world, invisible and undetectable, waiting for the right conditions to grow again. For over 200 years, the Whitakers worked in shadow, convinced they were creating divinity. What they really created was a keyhole. For 6 days in a small Virginia hospital, the entire world was visible through it. We glimpsed a plan so vast and patient it defies human imagination. A program that may still be running in quiet, forgotten places where blood is kept pure and old rules are followed. The silence you feel when this ends is the echo of that delivery room. The unease is knowing that once opened, the door can never truly be closed again.